Life has a funny way of surprising you when you least expect it. For Rebecca Chen, that surprise came on an ordinary Tuesday morning at her favorite coffee shop. She was rushing to grab her usual morning brew before heading to work when someone accidentally bumped into her, nearly spilling coffee all over her crisp white blouse. That someone turned out to be Thomas Walker, a tall, well-dressed man with kind eyes and an apologetic smile. "I'm so sorry," he said, quickly grabbing napkins from the counter. "Please, let me buy you another coffee to make up for my clumsiness." His genuine concern and warmth made Rebecca laugh, easing the tension of the moment. Little did she know this chance encounter would change her life forever. At 45, Rebecca had spent the last 10 years focused solely on raising her daughter, Emmy, now a bright college student studying business. Dating hadn't been a priority. Between running her small bookkeeping business and being a single mom, there simply hadn't been time. But Thomas was different from anyone she'd met before. Their coffee shop conversation flowed naturally, making her almost late for work. Thomas, as she learned, was a real estate developer who had recently moved to the city to expand his business. He spoke passionately about his projects, particularly his focus on developing affordable housing for families. His eyes lit up when talking about community development, and Rebecca found herself drawn to his apparent dedication to helping others. Over the next few months, Thomas became a constant presence in their lives. He helped Emmy with her business school applications, drawing from his own experience to offer valuable advice. He surprised Rebecca with thoughtful gestures, leaving sticky notes with sweet messages on her laptop, bringing soup when she caught a cold, and even organizing a surprise birthday party that brought happy tears to her eyes. Emmy initially watched this budding romance with cautious optimism. Having seen her mother weather tough times after her father left them for another family, she was protective of Rebecca's heart. But Thomas seemed genuine. He attended Amy's college presentations, celebrated her achievements, and never tried to replace her father. Instead, he carved his own special place in their family dynamic. "Mom deserves this happiness," Annie told her best friend during one of their study sessions. "Thomas makes her smile in a way I haven't seen since. Well, since before Dad left." And it was true. Rebecca was glowing. She started humming while cooking, bought new dresses for their dates, and laughed more freely than she had in years. The proposal came 8 months later during a family dinner Thomas had organized at Rebecca's favorite restaurant. He had arranged for Emmy to be there, acknowledging that this decision affected both mother and daughter. With tears in his eyes, he spoke about how meeting Rebecca had changed his life, how her strength and grace had inspired him to be a better person, and how he couldn't imagine his future without them both in it. Rebecca's yes was immediate, but it was Amy's tight hug and whispered, "I'm so happy for you, Mom," that made the moment perfect. The restaurant erupted in applause as Thomas slipped the elegant but modest ring onto Rebecca's finger. A ring he said he'd chosen because it reminded him of her. Beautiful without being flashy, classic yet unique. Wedding planning began almost immediately, with Rebecca and Amy throwing themselves into the details. Thomas insisted on contributing significantly to the costs, brushing aside Rebecca's protests by saying, "Let me do this for us. You've worked so hard all these years. It's time someone took care of you for a change." Their house was soon filled with bridal magazines, fabric swatches, and endless discussions about flowers and venues. Thomas participated enthusiastically in the planning, offering suggestions while always ensuring Rebecca had the final say. He even found ways to incorporate meaningful touches, like proposing they use Rebecca's grandmother's vintage lace tablecloths as part of the decoration. The future looked bright. Thomas's business was thriving, and he spoke of buying a bigger house where they could all spend holidays together, even after Emmy graduated and started her own life. He talked about travel plans, about showing Rebecca all the places he'd visited during his business trips, and about creating new memories together. Everyone who knew Rebecca commented on her transformation. Her sister remarked that she seemed younger, more vibrant. Her co-workers teased her about her constant smiling. Even her usually stoic father gave Thomas his approval, saying he'd never seen his daughter so happy. As the wedding date approached, Rebecca felt like she was living in a dream. After years of struggling and sacrificing, she had found not just love, but a partner who seemed to understand and appreciate both her and her daughter. The universe had finally smiled upon her, or so she thought. But sometimes, when things seem too perfect to be true, they usually are. The first hint that something wasn't quite right came on a rainy Sunday afternoon, just 6 weeks before the wedding. Amy had offered to help Thomas organize his home office for the upcoming move to their new house. She remembered how he'd hesitated for a split second before agreeing, but she dismissed it as her imagination at the time. The office was surprisingly bare for a successful real estate developer. A sleek laptop sat on a modern desk, alongside a few manila folders and a small filing cabinet. "Most of my work is digital now," Thomas had explained with his usual charming smile. "But these old files need to be sorted before we move." He'd left her to the task, mentioning something about a business call he needed to make. As Amy began organizing the papers, her business student instincts kicked in. Something about the documents didn't add up. In one folder, she found business cards with different company names: Walker Development Group, Summit Real Estate Solutions, and Pinnacle Investments. Each listed Thomas as the CEO, but with slightly different middle initials. Strange, she thought, but maybe there was a reasonable explanation. Then she found the photographs, tucked away in a weathered envelope at the bottom of the filing cabinet. They showed Thomas with another family, a woman and 2 children, at what looked like a graduation ceremony. The photos weren't old. The timestamp showed they were taken just 2 years ago. Amy's hands trembled as she noticed Thomas wearing the same distinctive watch he always wore, the one he claimed was a family heirloom. Her heart racing, Amy pulled out her phone and quietly took pictures of everything that seemed suspicious. Her advanced accounting professor had always emphasized the importance of documentation, though she'd never imagined using those lessons in her personal life. The more she dug, the more red flags appeared. Bank statements showed regular transfers to offshore accounts. Company registration documents displayed different social security numbers. Even Thomas's business licenses had varying birth dates. A text from her mother interrupted her investigation. "Hope you're helping Thomas settle in. He's making your favorite lasagna for dinner tonight." Amy's stomach churned. The man her mother was about to marry wasn't who he claimed to be. But how could she prove it? More importantly, how could she tell her mother without shattering her newfound happiness? Just then, she heard footsteps approaching. Amy quickly returned the documents to their original places, her hands shaking slightly as she closed the filing cabinet. When Thomas appeared in the doorway, she forced a smile. "Almost done here," she said, proud of how steady she kept her voice. "You've got quite a filing system." Thomas's eyes darted around the room, and for a moment, Amy saw something unfamiliar in his expression, a flash of calculation that made her skin crawl. But it disappeared so quickly she might have imagined it. "Thanks for your help, sweetheart," he said warmly. "Your mother's lucky to have such a thoughtful daughter." That evening at dinner, Amy watched Thomas through new eyes. He was his usual charming self, telling funny stories about his day and asking about her mother's work. But now she noticed how he deflected certain questions, how he never quite gave specific details about his past. When her mother mentioned wanting to invite some of his college friends to the wedding, he smoothly changed the subject. Back in her apartment that night, Amy couldn't sleep. The weight of her discoveries pressed down on her like a physical thing. Her mother had been through so much already: the painful divorce, the struggles of single parenthood, the years of putting her own life on hold to provide for Amy. She'd finally found happiness, or so it seemed. How could Amy take that away? But the alternative was worse. If Thomas was who Amy suspected he might be, a con man, a fraud, possibly worse, then staying silent would make her complicit in whatever he was planning. The regular transfers to offshore accounts suggested he was preparing for something. The wedding was just weeks away, and her mother had already added Thomas to some of her accounts, despite Amy's gentle protests about moving too fast. Opening her laptop, Amy began to dig deeper. Her cybersecurity elective was about to come in handy. She needed more than suspicions, she needed proof. Her mother deserved the truth, no matter how painful it might be. As her search history filled with background check websites and public records databases, Amy made a silent promise. She would protect her mother, whatever the cost. The clock on her wall ticked past midnight as she followed digital breadcrumbs, each new discovery adding to her growing dread. Somewhere in Thomas's past lay the truth that could save her mother from what was coming. She just had to find it before it was too late. Time became Amy's enemy as she dug deeper into Thomas's past. Every night after her business classes, she would sit at her desk until the early hours, following paper trails and connecting dots. Her roommate noticed the dark circles under her eyes, but assumed she was just stressed about finals, if only it were that simple. Her first breakthrough came through a local news article from 3 years ago. It mentioned a Thomas Wilson, not Walker, receiving an award for his contributions to a community development project in a neighboring state. The photo was grainy but unmistakable. Thomas, with the same confident smile he'd worn when proposing to her mother. The project had seemed legitimate at first. Thomas had collected investments from local residents, promising to build affordable housing. The article praised his vision and community spirit. But when Emmy cross-referenced the dates, she found something disturbing. 3 months after this glowing piece, the local paper ran a smaller story about the project's mysterious collapse. The development company had vanished, along with nearly $800,000 in investor money. Emmy's hands shook as she copied the article into her growing evidence folder. She'd started keeping everything on an encrypted USB drive, paranoid about Thomas somehow discovering her investigation. Her cybersecurity professor would have been proud of her careful documentation and digital security measures. Late one night, while scanning through property records, she found a connection to another name, Thomas Bradford. Same height, same educational background claimed, but a different business venture. This time, it was a string of luxury condos in a coastal town. The pattern was identical: charm the locals, collect investments, disappear. What truly chilled her was finding the restraining orders. 2 previous wives, both successful businesswomen, had filed them after losing everything. The first, Patricia Henderson, had owned a thriving chain of boutiques before meeting Thomas. Within a year of their marriage, her business accounts were drained, and Thomas had vanished. The second, Marie Collins, lost her family's restaurant chain the same way. Emmy reached out to both women through a secure email account she'd created. The responses came quickly, filled with pain and warnings. "He's incredibly convincing," Patricia wrote. "By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. The man I thought I knew never existed." Marie's reply was even more devastating. "He studied me for months before we met. What I thought was a chance encounter was carefully planned. He knew exactly how to be the man I wanted because he researched everything about me." The similarities to her mother's story were horrifying. The coffee shop meeting, the shared interests, even the way he'd helped Amy with her studies, had it all been calculated? Amy started noticing other things too. Thomas had begun subtly encouraging her mother to consider early retirement, suggesting she could live off the proceeds from selling her business. He'd even recommended a friend who was interested in buying the company. One afternoon, Amy skipped her financial analysis class to drive to the address listed on one of Thomas's old business licenses. Instead of an office building, she found a mail processing center. The owner remembered Thomas, or rather, remembered multiple men using similar names, all renting mailboxes for their business ventures. The evidence was mounting, but Amy knew she needed more. Her mother was practical, not easily swayed by hunches or coincidences. She needed irrefutable proof before she could even think about revealing what she'd discovered. The wedding was now just weeks away, and she'd noticed Thomas growing more attentive to her mother's business affairs. A breakthrough came when she managed to track down a former employee from one of Thomas's companies. The man, now working as a janitor, agreed to meet her in a public coffee shop. "I kept copies of everything," he whispered, sliding a thumb drive across the table. "Been waiting for someone to finally catch up to him." The drive contained internal emails, bank statements, and most importantly, photos of Thomas with various business partners, all of whom had later filed police reports about investment fraud. In one particularly damning email, Thomas had openly discussed his exit strategy and plans for moving money through shell companies. But the investigation was taking its toll. Amy's grades were slipping, and she'd had to make excuses to miss wedding planning sessions. Her mother had noticed something was wrong, but Amy brushed it off as school stress. Each time she saw her mother's happy smile or heard her talking about the future, Amy felt sick to her stomach. The final piece clicked into place when she discovered a pattern in Thomas's banking activity. Every time he disappeared, There was a series of transfers to accounts in the Cayman Islands, followed by the formation of a new company under a slightly different name. Looking at her mother's recent bank statements, Amy recognized the beginning of the same pattern. Time was running out. The wedding was just days away, and Thomas had already convinced her mother to liquidate some of her retirement accounts for a can't-miss investment opportunity. Amy knew she had to act soon, but she also knew that once she revealed the truth, nothing would ever be the same. The week before the wedding felt like walking through quicksand. Every step was heavy with the weight of what Amy knew and what she had to do. Her mother had noticed her distraction during the final dress fitting, asking if everything was all right. Amy had forced a smile and blamed it on upcoming exams, hating herself for every lie. That evening, she sat in her favorite coffee shop, spreading her evidence across the table. Photos, bank statements, newspaper clippings, and sworn statements from Thomas's previous victims. It was all there. The barista had already refilled her cup twice, concerned by her obvious distress. Wedding planning stress? She'd asked sympathetically. Amy had just nodded, unable to explain that she was actually planning to stop a wedding. Her phone buzzed with a message from her mother. Just picked up the wedding favors. Thomas suggested we use his friend's company that gave us such a good deal. Each message like this made Amy's stomach turn. Thomas had gradually inserted himself into every aspect of her mother's life, always with a suggestion, always with a better deal through one of his connections. She tried to warn her mother subtly at first. During a cake tasting session, she'd casually mentioned how little they actually knew about Thomas' past. "Oh, honey," her mother had laughed, "sometimes when you know, you just know. Look how carefully he takes care of us both." Amy had watched Thomas across the room, charming the baker with his easy smile, and felt sick. Another attempt came during a dinner at their house. Amy had brought up recent news about investment scams targeting women. Thomas had smoothly changed the subject, but not before Amy caught a flash of something cold in his eyes. Later that night, he pulled her aside. "Your mother's been through enough worry in her life, don't you think?" His tone was gentle, but Amy heard the warning beneath it. The hardest part was watching her mother bloom with happiness. Rebecca had started taking better care of herself, bought new clothes, and even joined a yoga class. "Thomas says I should do things for myself," she told Amy over lunch. "He says I've spent too many years just working and being a mom." The joy in her mother's voice felt like knives in Amy's heart. Her aunt had noticed something was wrong during the bridal shower. Finding Amy alone in the kitchen, she'd asked directly what was bothering her. For a moment, Amy had been tempted to share everything. But her aunt was her mother's sister, and she couldn't burden her with this knowledge without proof she'd accept. "Just worried about Mom rushing into things," she'd said instead. Her aunt had hugged her, misunderstanding the source of her concern. The evidence folder on her laptop grew daily. Amy had created a timeline of Thomas's previous scams, noting how each followed the same pattern: charm, integrate, isolate, then disappear. He was already working on the isolation, subtly suggesting her mother spend less time with old friends who didn't understand their relationship. One night, unable to sleep, Amy drove past Thomas's house. A light was on in his office, and she could see him on the phone pacing. Through the window, his gestures looked animated, angry, so different from his usual calm demeanor. She'd sat there in her car, recording a video with her phone, wondering if her mother would even believe her if she showed her this other side of him. The breaking point came 3 days before the wedding. Her mother called, excited about a new investment opportunity Thomas had suggested. "He says we should pool our resources," she bubbled. "He's found this amazing property development opportunity. We could double our money in 6 months." Annie recognized the pitch. It was almost word for word what he told his previous victims. That night, Amy sat in her apartment surrounded by printouts and photos, trying to find the words to break her mother's heart. How do you tell someone that their happiness is built on lies? That the man they trust completely is a careful fabrication? She thought about all the times her mother had protected her, had put her first, had given up her own dreams to ensure Amy had opportunities. Now it was her turn to protect her mother, but the cost seemed impossible. If she showed her mother the evidence, she'd be destroying not just her relationship with Thomas, but possibly her mother's ability to trust again. If she stayed silent, She'd be letting a predator take everything her mother had worked for. An alert popped up on her phone, a reminder for tomorrow's wedding rehearsal dinner. Her hands trembled as she picked up her mother's favorite photo of Thomas, the one from their engagement party. His smile, once charming, now seemed calculated. Every detail, from his casual pose to his attentive gaze at her mother, felt like part of a performance. Time had run out. Tomorrow, during the rehearsal dinner, she would have to find a way to tell her mother everything. But as she packed up her evidence, another thought haunted her. What if Thomas realized she knew? The look in his eyes during that dinner conversation hadn't been just cold, it had been threatening. She needed to be careful, not just for her mother's sake, but for her own safety. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear, a perfect day for a ceremony that Emmy was determined would never take place. She arrived at the church early, clutching her manila envelope of evidence like a shield. The wedding coordinator bustled around, arranging flowers and directing the setup crew, completely unaware of the storm about to break. Emmy's hands trembled as she checked her phone one last time. An email had arrived overnight from Murray, one of Thomas's previous victims. Be careful. When I confronted him, he showed his true colors. Make sure you're not alone. The warning sent chills down her spine, but she couldn't wait any longer. Her mother had already transferred a significant amount of money into a joint account for their investment opportunity. The church was quiet except for the distant sound of the organist practicing. Emmy found Thomas in the groom's preparation room, already dressed in his tuxedo. He was on his phone, speaking in a low, intense voice that she'd never heard him use before. Make sure the transfers are ready, he was saying. Everything needs to be in place by noon. She pushed the door open fully, letting it bang against the wall. Thomas spun around, his face shifting from anger to surprise to his usual charming smile in the space of a second. Emmy, you're here early, sweetheart. He ended his call quickly, slipping the phone into his pocket. Just taking care of some last-minute business details. I know what kind of business you're taking care of, Emmy said, her voice steadier than she felt. She pulled out a stack of papers from her envelope. Thomas Walker, or should I say Thomas Wilson, or maybe Thomas Bradford. You've had so many names, it's hard to keep track. The change in his expression was instant and terrifying. The warm smile vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating. You've been busy, he said softly, taking a step toward her. Quite the little investigator. Your mother mentioned you were good with numbers. Emmy held her ground, though her heart was racing. I know everything. The fraud schemes, the stolen money, the destroyed lives. Patricia Henderson, Marie Collins, they told me what you did to them. She spread the documents on a nearby table. It's all here. Every company you've created and destroyed, every account you've drained, every life you've ruined. Thomas's laugh was nothing like the warm chuckle her mother loved. And what exactly do you plan to do with this information? Your mother won't believe you. No one ever believes it until it's too late. I'm the best thing that's ever happened to her. She tells me that every day. She'll believe bank statements, and he counted, pulling out more papers. She'll believe police reports. She'll believe photos of you with your other families, living other lives. Did you think nobody would ever connect the dots? He moved faster than she expected, grabbing her wrist. His grip was like iron, his facade completely gone now. You have no idea what you're dealing with, little girl. Your mother's so desperate for love, so eager to believe in happy endings. By the time she realizes anything's wrong, I'll be gone. And so will everything she's worked for. Annie tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. Think carefully about what you're doing, he continued, his voice dangerously soft. Your mother's already signed everything over. One phone call, and it all disappears. Is that what you want? To destroy her happiness and her future in one go. Let go of me, Andy demanded, her voice shaking but determined. You're not going to win this time. I've already sent copies of everything to the police, to your previous victims, to every person who needs to know the truth about you. His other hand shot out, knocking the remaining papers from her grip. You stupid child, he snarled. You think you're protecting her. All you're doing is ensuring she loses everything. I was going to leave her enough to start over, more than the others got. But now, he yanked her closer, his mask completely shattered. Now she'll lose it all, and it'll be your fault. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made him release her suddenly, stepping back and straightening his tie. The warm smile snapped back into place as the door began to open. But Amy had managed to do what she needed. Her phone had been recording in her pocket the entire time, catching every word, every threat. She backed toward the door, rubbing her wrist where his grip had left marks. "It's over, Thomas. Whatever you're planning, however do you think this is going to end? It's over." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "I won't let you destroy my mother's life like you destroyed theirs." His eyes met hers, and in them she saw something that made her blood run cold, not just anger, but a calculated ruthlessness that told her this confrontation was far from over. The real Thomas had finally shown himself, and he was more dangerous than she had imagined. As she turned to leave, she heard him make another phone call, his voice urgent and low. She had thrown down the gauntlet, but the final battle was still to come. The church bells chimed 11 as guests began filling the pews. Amy stood in the back, her heart pounding against her ribs. She changed from her bridesmaid's dress back into regular clothes, drawing confused looks from the other wedding party members. Her phone felt heavy in her pocket, the recorded confrontation with Thomas like a loaded weapon. Through the crowd, she spotted two women slipping quietly into the back row, Patricia and Murray, Thomas's previous victims. They'd flown in after Amy's desperate call the night before, determined to help stop another woman from sharing their fate. Their presence gave her strength, knowing she wasn't alone in this fight. The organist began playing soft background music as more guests arrived. Amy watched Thomas working the room, shaking hands and laughing with her mother's friends and family. He caught her eye across the church and gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head, a final warning she chose to ignore. Her mother arrived in the bridal room, radiant in her wedding dress. "Amy, honey, why aren't you dressed?" Rebecca asked, concern crossing her face. "And what happened to your wrist?" The bruises from Thomas's grip were starting to show, but Amy kept her sleeve pulled down. "I'll explain everything soon, Mom. I promise." The wedding coordinator began lining everyone up for the processional. Amy saw Thomas take his place at the altar, looking every bit the perfect groom. She thought about all the other times he must have played this role, all the other women who'd trusted him with their hearts and their futures. As the music changed to the wedding march, Amy's aunt nudged her. "You need to get in line." But Amy stood firm. "No," she said quietly. "I need to do something else." Her aunt's confused expression added to the weight in her chest, but she couldn't back down now. Rebecca began her walk down the aisle, clutching her bouquet. She looked so happy, so full of hope. Amy felt tears sting her eyes, knowing what she was about to do. But the alternative, watching her mother lose everything, was unthinkable. Halfway through the processional, Amy stepped into the aisle. "Mom, wait." Her voice carried through the church, causing heads to turn. The music stuttered to a stop. "There's something everyone needs to know." The confusion on her mother's face was heartbreaking. Thomas stepped forward from the altar, his expression a perfect mask of concern. "Amy, sweetheart, what's wrong?" "Don't call me that," Amy said, her voice growing stronger. She pulled out her phone and the envelope of evidence. "The man standing at that altar isn't who any of you think he is. His name isn't even Thomas Walker." Murmurs rippled through the congregation. Amy's hands shook as she opened the envelope, but her voice remained steady. "This man has spent years perfecting a scheme to defraud women of their life savings. He finds successful single mothers, learns everything about them, and becomes exactly who they want him to be." Thomas took another step forward, his face a picture of hurt confusion. "Amy, I know you're worried about your mother, but this is—" "I have proof." Amy cut him off, holding up her phone. "Including your own words from this morning, when you finally showed me who you really are." She touched her wrist, where his fingerprints were still visible beneath her sleeve. Patricia and Mary stood up from their seats. "We're proof too," Patricia called out. "He did the same thing to us. Different names, same scheme." Marie nodded, adding, "He took everything we had." The perfect mask on Thomas's face began to crack. Rebecca stood frozen in the aisle, her bouquet trembling in her hands. "Amy, what are you saying?" Amy walked to her mother, holding out the evidence. "He's already started transferring your money, Mom. The joint account, the investment opportunity, it's all part of his plan. Once he has everything, he'll disappear, just like he did to them." "That's ridiculous," Thomas snapped, but there was an edge of panic in his voice now. "Rebecca, honey, you know me. You know our love is real." Amy pulled up the recordings on her phone, and Thomas's own voice filled the church. "Your mother's so desperate for love, so eager to believe in happy endings. By the time she realizes anything's wrong, I'll be gone, and so will everything she's worked for." The color drained from Rebecca's face as she listened to the man she loved reveal his true nature. More recordings played. His threats to Emmy, his cold calculation about leaving Rebecca enough to start over, his anger at being discovered. "There's more," Emmy said, passing her mother the stack of evidence. Bank records showing the same pattern with other victims. News articles about his fake development projects. Police reports. Photos of his other lives, other families. Thomas's charm finally shattered completely. He looked wildly around the church, like a cornered animal. Amy saw his hand move toward his pocket, probably reaching for his phone to make the transfers he threatened. "Don't bother," she said clearly. "The police already froze all the accounts this morning. They just needed a confession, which you gave them when you threatened me. They heard everything through a live feed." The church doors opened, and 2 police officers stepped inside. Thomas looked from them to the exits, his face twisting with rage. All pretense of the perfect gentleman was gone, replaced by the calculating criminal he'd always been. The guests watched in shocked silence as years of careful deception crumbled in minutes. In the chaos that erupted, Thomas made his final desperate move. He shoved past the pastor, knocking over a flower arrangement as he sprinted toward the side exit. The wedding guests gasped and moved aside, but he didn't get far. The police officers had anticipated this reaction, and 2 more were waiting at every exit. "Thomas Walker, you're under arrest," the lead officer announced, his voice echoing through the church as they handcuffed Thomas. The perfect suit, the charming smile, the confident stance, it all crumbled away, revealing the cornered criminal beneath. Rebecca stood frozen in the aisle, still in her wedding dress, watching as her dream turned into a nightmare. Annie rushed to her mother's side, supporting her as her legs seemed to give way. "I'm so sorry, Mom," she whispered, holding her mother close. "I had to stop him before he took everything." The recording of Thomas's threats continued to play from Amy's phone, his cold voice filling the church. "Your mother's already signed everything over. One phone call, and it all disappears." The contrast between those cruel words and his previous loving behavior made several guests shake their heads in disbelief. As the police led Thomas away, he tried one last time to maintain his facade. "Rebecca, they're making a mistake. Everything I did was for us." But his words rang hollow now, especially when Patricia and Mary stepped forward to give their statements to the police. "He took everything from me," Patricia told the officers, her voice steady. "My business, my savings, even my children's college funds. He disappeared 2 days after accessing the accounts." Marie nodded, adding, "Same pattern with me. Once he had control of the money, he vanished. We never saw a penny of it again." The wedding coordinator, trying to maintain some sense of order, began ushering the shocked guests toward the reception hall, where they could at least sit down and process what they'd witnessed. Emmy's aunt took charge, making sure everyone had water and trying to keep the situation calm. In a quiet corner of the church, Rebecca finally found her voice. "How long have you known?" she asked Emmy, her words barely above a whisper. Emmy held her mother's hands, explaining everything. The discovery of the documents, the investigation, the connections she'd made, and the help she'd received from Thomas's previous victims. "I wanted to tell you sooner," Emmy said, tears flowing freely now. "But I needed proof you couldn't doubt. He was so good at explaining things away, at making his lies sound reasonable. I had to make sure he couldn't talk his way out of it." To Emmy's surprise, her mother pulled her into a tight hug. "My brave, brilliant girl," Rebecca whispered. "You saved me. Not just my money, you saved me from living a lie." Her voice broke, but there was strength beneath the pain. "I raised you to stand up for what's right, no matter how hard it is. I just never thought you'd have to stand up to protect me." Over the next few hours, the true scope of Thomas's crimes became clear. The police investigation revealed over $2.3 million stolen from various victims across multiple states. His elaborate scheme had involved fake businesses, forged documents, and countless lies. Each victim's story was heartbreakingly similar. all strong, successful women who'd been carefully targeted and manipulated. The 911 call Emmy had made during their confrontation that morning proved crucial. The police had been listening live, gathering the final evidence they needed. Thomas's threats and admissions, combined with the financial records Emmy had uncovered, created an airtight case. In the days that followed, something unexpected happened. The women Thomas had victimized formed a support network, sharing their stories and helping each other heal. Rebecca, despite her pain, became a driving force in this community. Her experience as an accountant proved invaluable in helping other victims reconstruct their financial records and work with investigators. Emmy watched her mother transform her heartbreak into purpose. Together, they worked with advocacy groups to raise awareness about romance scams and financial fraud. Rebecca's story, though painful, helped other women recognize warning signs they might have otherwise missed. 6 months later, they sat together in the courtroom as Thomas received his sentence. The judge was particularly harsh, noting the calculated nature of his crimes and the devastating impact on his victims. As he was led away to begin his 15-year sentence, Rebecca squeezed Emmy's hand. "You know what's strange?" she said softly. "I'm actually grateful." Emmy looked at her mother in surprise. "Grateful?" Rebecca smiled, her eyes clear and strong. "Grateful that I have a daughter who loves me enough to risk everything to tell me the truth. Grateful that this happened before he could hurt more people. And grateful that somehow this terrible thing brought so many strong women together." That evening, they had dinner with Patricia and Murray, who had become close friends through their shared experience. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter despite the painful journey that had brought them together. As Annie watched her mother share stories and plans for the future, she saw no trace of the devastated woman from that wedding day. "Mom," she said during a quiet moment, "are you really okay?" Rebecca looked at her daughter, her eyes filled with wisdom and peace. "You know what I've learned? Real love, the kind you showed me, isn't about grand gestures or perfect words. It's about truth, even when it hurts. It's about being brave enough to protect the people you care about, even when it breaks your heart to do it." The sun was setting outside the restaurant window, painting the sky in shades of hope. Emmy thought about the long journey that had brought them here, from suspicion to investigation to that dramatic wedding day. The truth had cost them a dream, but it had given them something more valuable: reality, strength, and a deeper understanding of love in all its forms.